Slade, Chapter 1. The files and newspapers in Quentin Slade's office had almost become a patchwork wallpaper. Slade sat, looking at his notes through a cloud of smoke. He coughed a dry-sounding bark, cleared his throat, and took another drag from his cigar. He was looking for the dots, the kind that connect a person or a place to the case he was looking into. Who would have thought being a detective would have been actual work? He grumbled to himself. Slade had spent a few years as a local police officer before getting into the private eye business. A few years was all it took to realize that police work wasn't for him. Too much red tape. Too many people to answer to. It's not like he saw himself as a loose cannon who was too much of a roughneck to be controlled by someone else. No. Quentin Slade just couldn't stomach dumb people or dumb rules. The local PD had both in spades. Slade had an eye for detail, and he was quick with his hands, both of which served him well in his infamous 8-year career as a Dub City police officer. He had solved his fair share of cases, had a good track record for getting confessions, but his self-defense methods were a bit too grisly for management's taste. He had been on a 2-month off-duty stint pending investigation for giving a mugger a pretty nasty cut that it required 13 stitches. There were two sides to the story. The mugger had insisted that Slade held him at gunpoint and cut him open with a fixed blade for kicks. To hear Slade tell it, the mugger had gotten a hold of his piece, and the cut was out of self-defense. Still, a 6-inch slash above the eyebrows looked horrific. The chief had told Slade he would have been better off shooting the sorry SOB. Slade said he would keep that in mind for the next scuffle. Needless to say, it wasn't long after that Slade had decided to go into the problem-solving business himself. He would use old contacts from when he worked for DPD and get a hold of cold cases. It was simple. The most desperate people would pay the most money. Now, Slade did genuinely have a desire to help people who felt helpless, but, like everyone else, he also had a need to pay the bills. His contact with the local police department worked in records. Frank Cantor had been a beat cop for 20 years. He had done his fair share of pounding the pavement. After 20 years, it was either retire or take a desk job. Frank took the lesser of two evils and became a paper pusher. The case he had floated to Slade this week wasn't necessarily all that interesting. Blake Stinson. He went missing at the age of 24, leaving behind a wife and 4 kids. He was a painter who mostly did small commission works for banks, places of business, and sometimes private collectors. His work hadn't made him filthy rich, but his family was provided for. Still, most of what he had been able to put back into savings, his wife, Martha, had spent trying to find him. Blake went missing on a Thursday. He had on a brown pair of shoes that matched his favorite jacket. The last person to see him had been his youngest boy who had hugged his daddy's leg before he left for the day. Blake hadn't been a drunk or a druggie. He didn't have a beef with anyone. This was all Slade had to go off of. This wasn't much, but the client paid, and he had a job to get to. Slade's eyes felt dry, his throat was raw, and his feet hurt. He rubbed his face, a useless gesture of weariness that was supposed to wake him. "I'll be damned if I'm falling asleep again, not right now," he said. It was more of a plea rather than a defiant announcement. The doctors Slade had spoken with hadn't been able to figure out just what it was that he suffered from yet. There wasn't a name for it. His episodes, they would come and go, but they always got worse when he hadn't slept much, which was cruelly ironic. The less he would sleep, the more it would happen, and the more it happened, the less he wanted to close his eyes. His body would start to fall into a sort of paralysis. That's just what it felt like falling. After the falling stopped, he would be trapped. His eyes would open. But his body would be frozen in place. And then the creatures would come. Unearthly things, sometimes demons, sometimes people who weren't quite human. Sometimes he did see people. They were almost always people that he had failed to find during a case. Slade would see them walking around, talking, growling, sometimes threatening. Or he would hear sounds, footsteps, maybe crying or screaming. He knew what he saw when he was frozen wasn't real. He knew the sounds were false. But that didn't keep the experience from being altogether terrifying. His last episode hurt him to the marrow. It wasn't a monster that came to visit him in his state of helplessness, but a little mousy brown-haired girl of the age of 6. Carla Snow. That had been her name. Slade had gotten a missing persons report a few weeks ago. Her mother and father had paid Slade quite well to find their little girl, which he did, but not alive. He found the poor little thing in a makeshift grave by the wharfs, wrapped in a plastic tarp. She had been cleaned, dolled up with makeup and perfume that had a strong lavender scent. It was odd. Whoever had done this was a sick animal. That much was certain, but the body was taken care of with what could only have been described as love and tenderness. Maybe she had tried to get away from her kidnapper and had fallen, snapping her little brittle neck on accident. Maybe she had scorned the advances of her kidnapper and he had struck her in a fit of rage. Maybe. Maybes didn't matter when you had to tell a mother and father that you found their little girl, but she wasn't coming home. And maybes didn't matter when her ghost came calling in the middle of the night. Slade was laying in bed, frozen, waiting for his mind to betray him when she came walking in. Carla came into the bedroom, her little Mary Janes clicking on the apartment's hardwood floors, her white knee-highs scuffed and dirty. She had on that dress that Slade had found her in, a little light blue thing. She seemed quite alive and only had one thing to say. "You were too late." And with that, she was gone. But the guilt clung to Slade like a sick flu sweat. "Fuck sleep," Slade said, grabbing his hat and his coat. He slung his jacket on. His hand absent-mindedly made its way to a belt. He touched briefly at the leather sheath that held a 4-inch fixed blade. He always wore it horizontally, midline, so he could reach it with both his right or left hand if need be. After he checked for his Chiappa Rhino, a compact .357 Magnum revolver. It was there, snug inside of his waistband like a tooth in a jaw. Fuck sleep and fuck being sober. Slade headed out into the night and made his way to Petals, a stray dog of a blues bar, which by no coincidence at all happened to be by the wharf.